In my 28 years on the federal bench, presiding over thousands of cases, from the quiet intellectual property wars fought over patents to the massive, sprawling conspiracies unearthed in organized crime trials, you develop an acute, almost painful sixth sense for trouble. You learn to recognize the subtle shift in the courtroom air, the way the silence tightens before a major decision, the difference between professional confidence and pure, corrosive entitlement. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for the sight of Elias Sterling, Jr. striding into my courtroom that damp, raw Wednesday morning. This wasn't just a defendant or a lawyer. This man was the physical manifestation of the city's hidden power structure, the living symbol of the dynasty that believed its wealth insulated it from consequences. He radiated contempt like a toxic plume, a palpable, arrogant indifference that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He was 32, the only son of Senator Sterling, the most powerful political figure in the entire state, a dynasty built on generations of backroom deals, obscured favors, and iron-fisted, quiet control of every major city contract. The son had inherited the father's slick, expensive tailoring, but none of the father's forced, public charm. He had the kind of entitlement that believes rules are simply obstacles created for other people, a deeply ingrained belief in his own immunity. He wasn't there for a parking ticket or a minor violation. He was there for criminal obstruction of justice, and the air in the courtroom was thick with the silent understanding that this was more than a hearing. It was a deeply sophisticated, psychological trap set by the federal government. I sat at my bench, taking a careful, measured sip of the strong, lukewarm black coffee my clerk, Daniel, had poured, the kind of bitter, restorative brew that cuts through the morning fog and the tension. I felt the smooth, cold wood of the gavel under my palm, a familiar weight. The docket, displayed starkly on the screen, read, Elias Sterling, Jr. of failure to comply with federal subpoena. Let me give you the necessary context that explains the deep, heavy pit in my stomach. 3 months earlier, we had been forced to halt a massive public works corruption case, a $500 million school construction project scandal. The lead witness, a dedicated, honest city engineer named Ms. Alva Rodriguez, had suddenly become terrified into silence. Her key evidence, digital blueprints exposing a massive bidding fraud scheme and kickbacks, had vanished into thin air. We knew the interference went straight to the top of the local political machine. The federal prosecutor's office, running a shadow investigation for nearly 18 months, secured a subpoena for Elias Sterling, Jr., who was the nominal head of the family's development firm. The demand was simple: production of records and testimony under oath. A routine procedure designed to uphold transparency. But Elias Jr.? He didn't just ignore it. He treated the subpoena like a piece of junk mail, a slight beneath his notice. He failed to appear not once, not twice, but 3 separate times, forcing the government's hand. That repeated, deliberate defiance was why he earned his mandatory appointment in my courtroom for criminal contempt of a federal subpoena. My clerk, Daniel, a young man who trusts the written word and procedure above all human emotion, leaned in and whispered, his voice tight. Judge, the gallery is full of people we don't recognize. Lawyers from outside the district, corporate security types, maybe even some state politicians. Is that normal for a contempt hearing? Normal? Not in the slightest. The back rows were packed with quiet, stone-faced men in dark suits, their eyes constantly scanning, and in a strategically placed position in the corner sat a woman I didn't yet know, but whose focus was unnerving, Agent Helen Chow from the Federal Integrity Unit. She wasn't just observing. She was waiting. Her stillness was magnetic. My mind raced back to my own beginnings. I thought of the long hours I spent studying in law school, financed by scholarships and sheer grit, refusing the easy path of the corporate firms. I remembered the principle drilled into me by my mentors. The law must never be confused with the powerful. The very act of this man's noncompliance was a test, a challenge to the entire judicial branch. Elias Sterling, Jr. finally walked in at 9:47 a.m., a deliberate 15 minutes late. He didn't walk, he strolled, moving like the entire building existed solely for his convenience. His eyes swept the room, projecting an aura of expensive indifference. Behind him trailed his counsel, a sharp, polished, deeply uncomfortable attorney named Mr. Graham, whose suit probably cost more than my entire law school education. The lawyer looked utterly terrified, but the sun was radiating an unshakable confidence that spoke volumes. This judge, this courtroom, this law, none of it can touch me. I looked directly at the young man, my voice even, refusing to rise to his perceived status or his attempted drama. I had learned long ago that when dealing with bullies, the calmest voice holds the most power. Mr. Sterling, you failed to appear for 3 federally mandated testimony dates regarding a major fraud investigation. Do you have an explanation for the court for your willful noncompliance? And then came the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp, a moment of profound, institutional disrespect. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at me. He looked over my head, gave a dismissive half-smile to the packed gallery, and then turned back, his tone dripping with condescension. Judge, with all due respect, I had far more important matters to attend to. My firm manages multimillion-dollar contracts. I can't waste days sitting in here discussing obsolete building plans with junior prosecutors who don't understand the realities of business. More important things. Obsolete plans. This was not just a contempt citation. This was about the potential systematic theft of millions of taxpayer dollars and the deliberate silencing of a key witness. His arrogance was staggering, a direct, deliberate affront to the fundamental integrity of the judicial process. He was spitting on the very idea of accountability. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice cold and firm, pulling back the focus from his hubris to the law itself. In this courtroom, there is nothing more important than following a federal subpoena. The same law that allows your family to conduct its business and protect its assets is the law you swore to uphold. Your personal schedule is irrelevant. His lawyer, Mr. Graham, shot him a frantic, silent glare and leaned in to whisper furiously. I could imagine the counsel, apologize immediately. Show some contrition. But Elias Jr. was far past taking advice. He was high on the toxic rush of his own perceived immunity. He took a deliberate step closer to the bench, a move that is a profound act of disrespect, strictly forbidden without express permission, and began his true performance, aiming to intimidate. Judge, he began, his voice dropping slightly, attempting to sound reasonable yet powerful. I think you need a reminder of who you are dealing with. My family has sustained this city for 3 generations. We employ thousands. We fund every major municipal project. We have close, established relationships with every council member, every major financial institution, and the governor's office itself. They depend on us to keep the city running. I am not a criminal, Your Honor. I am an essential public figure. I felt the familiar, hot pressure rise in my chest, the one that tells you a bully is testing your limits, trying to establish dominance. I'd grown up seeing people like the Sterlings, men who confuse inherited wealth with inherent righteousness. I thought back to the sacrifices my parents made, ensuring I understood that power must be earned through integrity, or it becomes a corrosive, systemic poison. This man was toxic, entitled, and he was daring me to challenge the established order. Mr. Sterling, I reiterated, my voice cutting through his self-importance like a scalpel. The only relationship that matters in this court is your relationship with the truth. You have violated a direct court order. Are you prepared to acknowledge your contempt and set a date for your deposition? Instead of answering, he pivoted again, surveying the packed courtroom. He was playing to the audience, the hidden observers, the people he imagined were there to see him walk away free, proving his power. His eyes, when they returned to mine, held nothing but absolute, chilling contempt. He was not just defying me. He was performing the defiance for the benefit of every corrupt official in the city. Judge, he said, his voice now loud enough to echo off the high ceilings and marble walls. I think you need to understand the practicalities of this city. I run this town. Not the mayor, not the city council, and certainly not the bench. I decide which contracts get approved, which cases get dropped, which buildings get permits. And frankly, I don't think you appreciate the incredibly difficult, almost impossible, position you are putting yourself in here by making this contempt matter a public spectacle. You are making a professional mistake, Judge. A palpable wave of collective dread washed over the spectators. I saw my court reporter's fingers slow and finally stop moving above the keyboard. She was simply staring. I saw the flash of profound alarm in my Clark Daniels' eyes. But most importantly, I saw the subtle shift in the expression of Agent Helen Chow in the back row. Her posture went from tense observation to coiled, lethal readiness. That single, tiny movement was everything. I slowly removed my reading glasses, a deliberate, precise action that, after nearly 3 decades on the bench, signals the end of patience and the beginning of resolve. I polished the lenses slowly, gaining the necessary seconds to control the rising heat in my chest. I thought about the hundreds of honest city workers, the dedicated teachers, and the small business owners who lived under the oppressive heel of the Sterling machine. And I focused entirely on the first principle of the justice system: equality under the law. "Mr. Sterling," I said, standing up again, forcing him to look up, a move of ultimate judicial gravity. "Let me tell you how this system works. Nobody runs this town except the Constitution and the law it creates. Not you, not your father, not the city's money. The law prevails. And right now, you are in flagrant and documented violation of it." But he was past the point of no return. He completely lost all sense of self-preservation, driven by the fear that his power was momentarily failing. His face flushed crimson, veins pulsing in his neck, and he started pointing a furious, trembling finger across the courtroom. "You know what, Judge? I've been patient, but you clearly need a reality check," he spat, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. "You sit up there in your little black robe, thinking you're important, but let me tell you how the real world works. I've got intelligence on everyone who matters in this city, judges included. I know who owes favors, I know whose home loan is under scrutiny, I know who's involved in messy corporate tax settlements. So maybe you should stop acting like an ethics professor and start thinking very carefully about how you want to handle this situation." Files on judges. The threat was open, brazen, and directed at the very foundation of the judiciary. This was no longer just contempt. This was an attempt to terrorize the court into submission. I looked back at Agent Chow. Her eyes were laser-focused on the defendant. She gave me a single, infinitesimal nod, a confirmation. His giving us everything we need. They had been waiting for the exact moment when the chief of staff, the inner circle, would be exposed, and the sun was doing their job for them. I sat back down, folding my hands on the bench, fighting to maintain an external calm that masked the internal personal fury. "Mr. Sterling," I continued, forcing the silence of the room to weigh on him, "I am going to ask you again, for the final time. Are you now, in open court, threatening the independence of the federal judiciary with the disclosure of private, potentially illegally obtained information?" "I'm not threatening anybody," he screamed, his voice wavering, now completely unhinged. "I'm stating facts. I'm simply stating the reality of how things work. You can either dismiss this ridiculous hearing and we can go back to business as usual, like every other judge in this city has done for the past 2 decades, or you can find out what happens when you don't play along." Mr. Graham, his lawyer, was practically vibrating with terror. He scrambled to his feet. "Your Honor, my client's remarks are clearly made under extreme emotional duress. We request an immediate recess to compose ourselves and consult legal strategy." "Sit down, counselor." Elias Jr. roared at his own attorney, dismissing him with an arrogant wave of his hand. "I'm handling this. I'll tell the judge how it works." He turned back to me, taking that forbidden step closer to the bench again, leaning in for his final, fatal gambit. "Judge Thorne, I'm going to give you one last chance to handle this quietly," he whispered, aiming for cold control. "Dismiss this contempt citation, forget about the missing records, and my father will ensure you get that unanimous vote for your reappointment to the bench next year. The easiest vote of your career. Otherwise..." "Otherwise what, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, my voice calm, the quiet before a catastrophic storm. He delivered the final, unforgivable line. His voice was a poisonous whisper, his eyes locked on mine with malicious intent. "Otherwise, I might have to start looking very closely at your daughter's medical practice. Funny how the city handles licenses and zoning reviews for specialized pediatric clinics. I can buy your whole family, Judge." The words hung in the air, a declaration of absolute, personal war. He had crossed the final, most sacred boundary. He had brought my daughter, an honest, dedicated pediatrician who built her practice with tireless effort and zero familial favors, into his cesspool of threats. The professional anger vanished. Only a personal, white-hot, righteous fury remained. "Mr. Sterling," I said, rising a third time, the thunder of the judicial process now fully unleashed. My voice was a controlled, powerful roar that carried absolute, zero-tolerance authority. "You have just crossed a line that no person, and I mean no person, has ever crossed in my courtroom, or to a sitting federal judge." That was the signal. Agent Helen Chow stood up from the back row. She was followed by 4 other individuals in dark suits who revealed their Federal Integrity Unit badges. They had been sitting in different sections of the courtroom the entire time, their positioning now revealed as a tactical net. The entire room went into stunned, disbelieving silence. Agent Chow walked slowly, deliberately down the aisle, her presence radiating a quiet, absolute dominance. "Elias Sterling, Jr.," she announced, her voice calm, clear, and utterly devastating. "You are under arrest by the Federal Integrity Unit for criminal contempt of a federal court, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and aggravated witness intimidation, including the explicit threat of a federal officer." Elias Jr.'s face went from crimson to a sickly, ashen white in an instant. All the arrogance, all the expensive polish, all the bravado evaporated in a puff of cold air. His power was an illusion, and the illusion had just shattered. "We have been monitoring this courtroom and this entire interaction," Agent Chow continued, her voice unwavering. "Every threat, every admission, and every attempt at intimidation has been recorded by federally installed audio and video surveillance. You gave us everything we needed, Mr. Sterling." As she clamped the handcuffs onto his wrists, the heavy metal click of the restraint echoing loudly through the silent courtroom, Elias Jr. looked desperately at me. The monster was gone. Only a pathetic, frightened young man remained, finally confronting the reality of his own mortality before the law. "Judge," he pleaded, his voice a broken, desperate whisper. I made a terrible mistake. I didn't mean any of it." "You know what I told him?" I looked him straight in his panicked eyes. "Mistakes are things you apologize for, Mr. Sterling. What you did was a declaration of war against the rule of law and an attack on my family. And the law just won." I called a 2-hour recess immediately after the agents escorted Elias Sterling, Jr., and his stunned lawyer from the courtroom. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the raw surge of personal anger and adrenaline. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators leaving in hushed, disbelieving groups. My clerk, Daniel, finally approached the bench, his face pale but radiating a quiet awe. "Judge," he whispered, that was magnificent. I have never witnessed anything like that in my career. The sheer nerve of that man to threaten your daughter." "I was doing my job, Daniel." I cut him off, needing to recenter myself in the judicial framework. "But the real job starts now. I keep thinking about Ms. Rodriguez, the city engineer, and all the good people who have been silent for years because they thought this family was truly untouchable. That public threat, broadcast and recorded, is the key to unlocking the entire city." Agent Chow approached the bench one last time before she left to process the arrest. "Your Honor," she said, her expression professional and grateful. "This was a 2-year investigation. We suspected the scope of his contempt, but we needed the explicit threats, the specific reference to your reappointment and your family's practice, to elevate the charges to the maximum level. We knew you wouldn't be swayed or intimidated. Thank you for holding the line." "Agent Collins," I replied, feeling the immense weight of the moment. In my courtroom, everyone gets treated the same. Status, connections, or threats, they all dissolve before the law. That is the only definition of the bench. The story exploded. Local news, national headlines, and cable news networks ran the unedited audio of the threats. Corrupt dynasty heir arrested in court after explicitly threatening federal judge's family and career. But that wasn't the important part. The important part came in the days and weeks that followed. Within 72 hours, 3 key city officials, all with long-standing ties to the Sterling contracts, resigned under internal pressure. The city engineer, Ms. Rodriguez, contacted the prosecutor's office, her fear finally replaced by courage. She was ready to testify. The blueprint evidence, now secured by the FBI, was the smoking gun that exposed the massive, multimillion-dollar fraud, immediately collapsing the Sterling development firm. 6 months later, I received a letter from the newly appointed special prosecutor. Elias Sterling, Jr. had pled guilty to multiple federal felony counts to avoid a lengthy trial, receiving a 10-year sentence in a maximum security federal prison. The conviction sent a shockwave through the state's political infrastructure, ending the Sterling dynasty overnight. But the letter that truly affirmed the day's purpose came from Ms. Rodriguez. She wrote, "Judge Thorne, when I first saw the headlines, I thought it was just political theater. But then I read the transcript. You stood up to the one man in this state everyone was terrified of. Because you took that stand, I found the courage to come forward. The evidence is now public, the corruption is exposed, and I have my integrity back. You showed me that the law is, without question, stronger than any political family. That is what justice looks like. It is not the dramatic arrest. It is the quiet, restorative courage it gives to the good people who have been silenced. Elias Sterling, Jr. learned the hardest lesson. He thought he could, by the law, intimidate the process and threaten the family of a sitting judge. He thought his dynasty made him immune. He thought utterly wrong. Power without humility is merely corruption waiting to happen. The law applies to everyone equally, from the least influential citizen to the most powerful political heir. And when institutions stand firm, democracy always wins. I'm Judge Marcus Thorne. Remember this, nobody runs this town except the Constitution itself. God bless.